This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Last week, floodwaters devastated several communities in Connecticut, washing out more than 24 state roads. As of this week, several roads remain washed out and closed, including parts of Route 34, 53, and 67. Drivers should expect long closures, and you can get more updates on road and bridge closures by visiting connecticutroads.com. Today, Connecticut Department of Transportation Commissioner Garrett Uccelito joins us to talk about the recent flooding and recovery. Plus, we'll get into the future of infrastructure here in Connecticut and how we can all stay safe on the road. This year alone, over 200 people have been killed on Connecticut roads. Commissioner, welcome back to the show.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
And listeners, let us know if you have a question or comment about highways, buses, and all things transit. We want to hear from you. What do the roads look like around where you live? Give us a call, 888-720-9677, or leave us a comment on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So, fresh on our minds, the recent floodings that had happened last weekend, and we've learned that more than 27 state roads have closed due to the flooding or damage after the severe storms that we saw. Can you give us an update on the damage that happened this week over the weekend?
Yeah, so, the amount of water that came down in such a short time span caused a lot of these rivers and brooks and creeks to really do significant damage. It caused debris to essentially clog the inlets of a lot of our bridges and culverts, which most of the damage we saw in our state roadway system was a result of the rivers jumping their banks and creating new paths over and underneath the roadways, creating new natural culverts, essentially, under what used to be roadbeds, and completely destroying the approaches to our bridges, just tearing up roadways and damaging some of our bridge structures. So for the past almost 2 weeks, we've been working nonstop. A lot of our crews have not had a day off since. They've been working 12 to 15-hour days, 7 days a week, to clean up as much debris as possible, inspect all the structures, make sure they're safe, and for those that are not safe, come up with a plan for reopening them. So we're down to about 8 or 9 closures at this point. Everything, there's a detour for everything. No one is isolated or cut off from their community anymore. We rebuilt the roads we needed to make sure people could get out of their homes. But it's going to be a little bit longer recovery for the remaining closures. We're going to try and do some temporary bridge structures where possible until we can build a permanent one. Right. But it's the damage was something we haven't seen in many decades.
Well, I mean, with what you just said, too, I think the phrase that we saw and heard a lot over the last week was historic. It's been a historic, significant damage to the roads and the weather that we saw. So can you talk about what will recovery look like in impacted communities? I'm imagining different communities that are going to see that recovery in different ways.
Yep. So Oxford saw most of the significant damage on the road, our state roadway side. Route 67 is a main thoroughfare for that community. For much of the state who passes through that area, 67 is a main commercial drag. So that's going to take a little while. It was really destroyed in multiple sections. So the communities are really pulling together to, find alternate routes, use local detours where possible. But the most important thing for us right now is try to restore some sense of normalcy, allow people to get back to patronizing the small businesses that they need to patronize, because those businesses are hurting right now. And we want to make sure that they have access to their client base. Where we can, we want to try and put in temporary bridges while we work on a permanent structure. That will significantly shorten the disruption time. And so, that's really what we're focused on right now. We can come in, we can put in a temporary bridge within the next 3 to 4 weeks. And then while we work on a long-term replacement, which may take a year and a half, because the longer-term replacements you have to do, there's long lead time to get the steel, to get all the materials, to do the design work. And so the temporary bridge, we have those available. We have a great contractor who can do that. So that's our goal right now, is where we have closures, let's put in some temporary structures or stabilize the roadway to at least get one lane open and get some people to be able to pass through those communities.
Well, it's good to hear that you have those materials on hand. I think previously we had talked about that was one of the major problems was not being able to get materials. And I mean, by getting the materials, you also need the finances to be able to bring those in. So what does that look like now? Like how much do you know how much money is needed to be rebuilt, to rebuild the infrastructure? And I imagine that this flooding is financially challenging for the state.
Yeah. So right now, we're estimating just on the state roadway side over $50 million to do repairs. Uh, what we're doing right now is we are using existing funding and financing within our agency, moving some funds from other projects to help fund this. Our hope is that the Federal Highway Administration will come in to be able to support the majority of the restoration and repair. We have submitted our paperwork to Federal Highway Administration indicating that we intend to file for what's called emergency relief. That would provide us 80% federal share towards these costs. So we've been in discussions with them. On the other side, we have the railroad, which has disrupted the Waterbury branch line, two significant washouts on the Waterbury branch line. That is not eligible for emergency relief funding right now. There is no federal transit or federal railroad emergency relief funding. So we are hopeful that there may be an opportunity to use FEMA funds. That's not a guarantee, but that's our hope right now. But we're trying to figure out what's the cost of that. It's still a very significantly different type of project. There's no access roads to get to the locations where the damage was. So we're trying to figure out a game plan for how to repair that.
Well, then you mentioned FEMA funding, and we know that we have, our state declared an emergency. And so, do you have an update or have an idea of when you would get an idea of what the role that FEMA could play in the funding, meeting the threshold and everything?
So we have to, within the storm, you have I believe it's 30 days following the storm to submit your official request for public assistance. So that is something that the Division of Emergency Management, Homeland Security is preparing. I believe they're intending to file as soon as they have solid estimates for damages. So partially they're waiting on us to come up with those estimates for the railroad. They're also waiting on other municipalities who are looking at their own infrastructure. So there are, while there's only around 9 state roads closed right now, there's also many more local roads that are damaged and destroyed. And so the local governments are collecting those costs and submitting that up as well, so we can bundle it all together, because there's certain thresholds that have to be met for FEMA to see whether we qualify or not.
Well, even before last week, we've had a lot of extreme weather this summer, and certainly, I think the last time we had this conversation, we were already talking about the changing patterns of climate and how that's influencing our infrastructure. But this year, we saw major flooding, deluges of rain, major storms, and we're also expecting, and we're currently in a very active hurricane season, which specifically in Connecticut will run all the way until November. How is this impacting roads and drivers? And also, we've talked about this before too, we're revisiting the idea that the infrastructure is old and in many cases historic. So are all of those elements as to why certain communities were impacted so hard?
Yeah, I mean, it's changing how we do business at Connecticut DOT. We are used to storm response and storm recovery. But, historically, we have been on the winter storm side. So our maintainers who go out and who have been the ones working, nearly 14 days straight, they're used to doing, 24-hour shifts during a winter storm, multiple days in a row. Now, for the past few summers, we've had major rainfall events, but very localized. So, a few years ago, we had in Norfolk, we had some bridges wash out due to flooding. Scotland saw multiple bridges wash out from flooding. Now we have in the Naugatuck Valley area. So it's becoming more frequent. It's changing how we need to think about our job as a state DOT. It's much more year-round storm response now. Right. But we also need to look at the infrastructure. What's the path forward in a changing climate? We have funding from the federal government. It's called PROTECT. It's really intended to help us come up with a resilience plan for our infrastructure. How do we strengthen our infrastructure to be able to withstand these higher rainfall events? We'll never be able to build it to withstand a 1,000-year storm, but we can build it to withstand higher rainfall events in general, or extreme heat issues. Those are all things that we need to be taking into account.
So, as you're thinking about how to make the roads more resilient, what does that look like?
So, part of it is more off alignment storage of rainwater. So, part of the reason these rivers and creeks and brooks become so full so quickly is that over the years, Connecticut has built more impervious surfaces, so more parking lots, more land that no longer can absorb the rainfall that comes down. It'll never be able to absorb a 1,000-year flood event, but if we can make sure that we're having some off-site storage of that rainwater, so it doesn't all go into the stormwater drainage system, back it up. Maybe we can store it off-site in a retention pond, things like that. We're coming up with green infrastructure, right? Some bioswales is another term for it. So places where we can retain some of that water instead of backing it up into the stormwater system is what we're looking at. You see it a lot of times along our limited access highways where you'll have some, if for lack of a better term, gullies, right, where water pools in the middle of the highway in those valleys. And that's really what's intended for, is to collect some of that water so to avoid it from going onto the highway system itself. So we need to think about how can we better do that on our state roadway system that is not a highway, and reinforce and basically strengthen our shoulders so the water doesn't wash away those shoulders, put better stone and better riprap there.
Well, as you're describing it, I'm thinking hydroplaning into work or something like that. And with that in mind too, as you are adapting to how the climate is influencing how you think about infrastructure, and as you rebuild the roads that have been damaged, what do you want drivers to know about driving during severe weather? Because I think it goes both ways. You're doing your work on figuring out how to make the roads safer. What can we as drivers do to sort of help with that?
Most important thing is never drive through standing water during a storm event. You don't know what's underneath the surface there. So I went out that Sunday evening to try to get to some of the damaged infrastructure, and I couldn't get there because we had so many local and state roads completely blocked off from flooding. But you don't know what's below the surface there. In some cases, the road was gone underneath that water. So if someone did try to go, their car ended up in that new chasm that was created. And we had pictures after the storm, people's cars in those new valleys created by the water. So that's the most important thing, is don't put yourself at risk by trying to go through that flowing water or standing water, because you don't know, one, what's underneath there, but two, flowing water is very powerful. Even several inches can pick up your car and move it, and take you where you don't want to go.
And we've also had over 200 people killed in traffic fatalities in Connecticut this year alone. We're hitting end of August, if you would believe it. So 216 to be exact. So what is happening here, and what is the state doing to prevent these accidents?
Yeah, it's really unsettling to see how high we are this year in terms of number of fatalities. We're on track to get close to where we were in 2022. 2022 was our deadliest year in our state roadways since the mid 80s. And vehicles are becoming much safer for people inside the vehicle if you drive them appropriately. Unfortunately, we have seen speeds are up significantly. More people are speeding, and they're driving faster when they're speeding. So the average difference between the posted speed limit and how fast people are driving has increased significantly since COVID, since 2020. This is not just a Connecticut issue. It is a national issue. Clearly, it's tied to mental health. There's people seem to be stressed out. They're more aggressive, and they're more angry behind the wheel. So that's something that, we at the DOT can't tackle alone. It's a community discussion. We need people to talk to their friends and family members. If they see that someone is struggling, talk to them. Refer them to, if it's a coworker, refer them to, if you have Employee Assistance Program or EAP, have a conversation. We're also seeing a continued issue in Connecticut where we continue to have a major drunk and drug driving problem. It is continuing to be a problem for us in Connecticut. We're always one of the highest offenders when it comes to drunk driving. impaired driving issues, and that's not going away. So all those factors combined are leading to more fatalities, more serious injuries. At the same time, we're trying to do everything we can to continue to make our roads safer. Countermeasures, more safe infrastructure, but infrastructure changes take time. And even as we're making those changes, it's not skewing the needle in terms of those who are dead or seriously injured in our roadway.
And so, ahead of this show, we also spoke with Alex Lackey, who's a director of public affairs at AAA Northeast, and we wanted to get his take as well on aggressive driving across Connecticut. And here's what he has to say.
We're absolutely seeing a big increase in the number of fatalities and serious injury crashes that are caused by people that are driving really aggressively. And we're seeing people failing to keep in the proper lane rise to one of the top contributing factors to crashes and have a big increase. People following too closely or just engaging in general reckless behavior. All of those, we've seen increases in Connecticut in the last few years. And it used to be that, you looked for danger ahead of you. You looked in your side view mirrors because you want to make sure you could change lanes safely. And then you looked in your rear view mirror just to see what was going on behind you, but you weren't necessarily expecting any danger. Now I feel like you look in the rear view mirror to see if there's someone coming up behind you that's going to endanger your life and the life of your vehicle occupants. And I can think of a couple times within the past year where I've swerved out of the way of a vehicle that's just coming from behind. And if I didn't take evasive action, it would have been a very serious crash or worse. And I feel like everyone has a story like that.
That was Alex Lackey, who's the director of public affairs at AAA Northeast. And Alec is correct, as we all have stories like that. In fact, just the other day, I swerved to the side to avoid getting hit on the side. So that was not fun. What are your thoughts on that, Commissioner? And also, do you have an idea in terms of comparing Connecticut to other states? What does that look like?
Yeah, so Alex completely right, and Alex a great member of our statewide Vision Zero Council. I appreciate everything he does on this issue. I see it every day when I'm driving to or from work. I drive my state vehicle. I'm driving the speed limit in the right-hand lane, and there's still people coming up, flashing their lights at me, and it's frustrating to see how aggressive people have become behind the wheel. Even if it's not a serious injury caused by a crash, if your aggressive driving results in a fender bender, I think people need to realize that fender bender on a highway, you have to pull over. You're putting multiple people at risk, not just yourself, the other driver that you caused a crash. That has economic consequences for the individuals who are involved in the crash. They may lose their vehicle for a period of time where now they may not be able to get to and from work or to and from school or medical appointments. It causes insurance rates to increase, and it causes insurance rates to increase for everyone in the state. It's not just those individuals. The insurance companies are taking into account Connecticut's driving habits, and we are seeing that on the insurance side. I'm not an insurance expert, but as I've heard from the industry, is that they look at the driving habits of the residents of the state and how many crashes are occurring, the fatalities, the injuries, and they take that into account in the insurance rates. And I think everyone has seen their car insurance rates increase. That makes it more unaffordable for people to be able to drive in this state. Or they make the decision to drive without insurance, which is even worse for all those involved. And then you have the mental health consequences as a result of being in that crash. It can lead to significant mental health issues, cause people to be afraid to drive. It is happening nationally, but more so in Connecticut. We are seen as more aggressive. The insurance industry is indicating that we have a higher incidences of aggressive driving in our state. We have a lot of congestion. We're a very crowded state. We're a very dense state, densely populated. That may be part of the reason why they're more aggressive here, but it's not the only reason. And so something else is going on behind the scenes, and it needs to be a community conversation about what's going on behind the wheel.
So consider this a PSA of please do not make rates higher. Everything's already a high cost situation. We cannot handle one more thing.
Yep.
And I mean, so we've been talking about aggressive driving, and I think some are more obvious than others, like high speed, someone coming up at you really fast behind your car. What are other major concerns about aggressive driving? Is what's considered aggressive actually at the end of the day?
Yeah, I mean, so for me, I look at our state employees and our construction workers who are at risk every single day on the side of the road, on a local road or a state road. We have people out there stopping traffic for construction. We have a lot of construction going on our roadways, whether it's construction to the roadways or utility work underground. And we have people speeding up and then going around standing traffic, around someone who's flagging the traffic and telling people to slow or stop. People are cutting people off. You don't know what's ahead of you there. There could be a worker about to step into the roadway. And, we saw in Hartford, someone who was doing some utility work, a construction worker who had worked on DOT projects in the past, who was killed in exactly that situation. We've had, a state trooper killed on the side of the roadway. We've had a DOT employee, my colleague, killed on the side of the roadway. So, it's not just, on the highways, it's everywhere. It's cutting people off. It's stopping suddenly. It's speeding through red lights, and speeding through communities, which, leads to a huge increase in pedestrian fatalities. We are way above where we used to be historically for pedestrian fatalities in the state. And that's because people are speeding, they're running red lights, and they're driving aggressively.
And just a quick reminder for our listeners that you can give us a call if you have any questions or comments and let us know what you're seeing on the road, 888-720-9677, or leave us a comment on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. And also, we've been talking a lot about drivers and being on the road, but Susan is calling in with a question related to public transportation. Susan, you are on the line.
Good morning. Thank you so much, Hi, Governor or Commissioner Ugolito. My name is Susan Feaster, and I am the founder of the Shoreline East Riders Advocacy Group. And my group advocates for more trains for Shoreline East and funding through legislation. We believe that we're an important link between New York, New Haven, and Boston, and it moves the people through the region, both commuters and visitors. We're only operating at 44% of our pre-pandemic level, even though most trains in Connecticut have been returned to 100%. And we all know that trains build ridership, not the other way around. We need to get drivers off the road for environmental and, of course, safety issues, which you have been discussing. I'd like to know how you will support the legislation fully funding the trains, because I followed a lot of your press releases and have listened to a lot of your public testimony over the past year or two, and you don't support us, and that's very concerning.
Thank you so much, Susan, for your call and your question. Commissioner?
Yeah, so, I think the Lamont administration has invested more in public transportation than at any time in our state's history. We have increased rail service on multiple routes, increased Northeast Regional trains, which connect Hartford to Washington, D.C., and increased service on the Waterbury Branch Line. We had a over $100 million investment in the infrastructure, a 44% increase in service. And then on the bus side, we have last year and the year before historic unprecedented levels of bus investment, service expansions across the state for buses. So we definitely support public transportation in all its forms. On the Shoreline East side, what happened was during COVID, a significant drop in ridership, major drop in ridership. And that was largely because most of the people who were using Shoreline East were able to telework, unlike other portions of our state railway network who still had to go into work. As recovery happened, we saw a slower recovery on Shoreline East side. We're currently at 50% service levels compared to pre-COVID service levels. And this past legislative cycle, the state budget that was provided to ConnDOT did add an additional $5 million in for this year's budget for us to add a few additional trains. So we're working with Amtrak to do that. We're going to add those trains in as soon as Amtrak is able to hire the staff to run those and give us the slots to run those. So we'll add those trains, and then we'll see what happens with the next budget cycle. We'll see what it does for ridership, whether ridership continues to increase. Shoreline East is a very seasonal train service where it's much higher ridership in the summer months, people taking the shoreline, going to the shoreline, going to New London, places like that, than in the wintertime. But, nevertheless, we're moving forward with adding those additional trains, and we're looking forward to see the ridership grow.
Well, thank you again, Susan, for your call. We're going to take a quick break here, but Connecticut Department of Transportation Commissioner Garrett Ugolino will be staying with us. Coming up next, we'll talk more updates about what's happening to Connecticut highways and roadway infrastructure. Let us know if you have a question. Give us a call, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. But if you're driving, make sure you pull over first to call or check us out on social media later. Safety first. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Today, we're talking about traffic, buses, bridges, roads, and all things transit with Connecticut Department of Transportation Commissioner Garrett Ugolino. And we want to get your questions and comments about what's happening on the roads around where you live. Let us know, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So, Commissioner, earlier we were also talking about, it was kind of shocking to hear that Connecticut has a huge drunk driving issue, and that is a big problem that AAA Northeast is also looking at. So here's what Alex Lackey, who's from AAA Northeast, who shared about what driving under the influence looks like in Connecticut versus other states.
We know that Connecticut has long had a higher percentage of fatalities that are related to impaired driving than the average state in the country. And what we see from the impaired driving data is alcohol is stubbornly a part of the equation, because you think back to the 80s, we've had 4 decades of campaigns, very successful campaigns, mind you, telling people don't drink and drive. And everyone agrees with that. We do surveys of drivers across the country to say, what do you think about certain behaviors? Do you think it's dangerous? And how often do you do it? And pretty much everybody agrees. If you have consumed enough alcohol to be over the legal limit, then you shouldn't be driving. But unfortunately, there's a lot of people that say they're doing it. About 7% of people say that within the past month, they've driven a car when they thought they might be over the legal limit. And as we've talked about ad nauseum in Connecticut, the legal limit's 0.08, which is already too high for you to be driving. If you're thinking at 0.08, I might be over the legal limit, unquestionably, you shouldn't be behind the wheel.
So, Commissioner, you echoed some of Alex's comments earlier. What are your reactions to what he has to say?
He's completely right. 0.08, in my opinion, for blood alcohol concentration is too high. If you are at 0.07, I would not put family members in the car with you. It's scientifically proven that you are impaired in some form or another. You have physical reactions to the alcohol in your system at that point. Legally, you're not impaired, but physically, I would consider you to be impaired. That's one reason that Connecticut DOT, for the past couple of years, we've been really pushing for the state to look to lower the blood alcohol concentration down to 0.05. Utah is the only state in the nation that has done that, but most of the rest of the world is below 0.05 or at 0.05 because they recognize the dangers at that level. It acts as a deterrence factor. It causes people to think before they get behind the wheel, hey, you know what? I'm going out drinking tonight. I'm going to plan for a sober ride home, whether that's arranging for a friend to pick me up, a family member, calling a taxi, Uber, Lyft, taking the bus, taking the train, and walking. So that's something that is definitely true. We also historically have had around 40% of our fatalities caused by alcohol impairment. And so that is consistently stubbornly high. It's higher than the national average. We're in the top 5 states usually. And so why that is the case, I struggle really to figure out why that is the case and why Connecticut seems to shrug off alcohol impairment. Most of us probably have been touched by a car crash in some form, whether someone we know or someone we love has been impacted by a car crash. We probably also know people impacted through a drunk driving crash. And yet we continuously are shrugging off the dangers posed by alcohol impairment. And it's something we really need to get a handle on.
And here we're going to take another quick call from Gary Greenberg, who's a former selectman from Scotland here in Connecticut. Gary, you have about a minute here.
Hi there. I just wanted to, first of all, say that in our disaster, Commissioner Iccolito was incredibly responsive, and so was the rest of the DOT engineering staff. It was really quite an unbelievable response. Secondly, I wanted to say that from the town point of view, none of our bridges is built for this climate, and so we're going to need a lot of dough for this, even before the bridges wipe out. Third, I wanted to say that I know there's been talk of a bond issue to specifically address this kind of thing, either on the resilience side or the disaster response side, and I hope that can get somewhere because the towns can't afford this. And finally, I just want to make a very specific suggestion, which is the state does own one temporary bridge that can be erected in a hurry. I understand that it's out of date, so they don't want to use it, but part of that money should be spent on having a few of those around in the event that there's a disaster like we had where two bridges went out on the same road and people were stranded. That kind of quick response is something that I'm sure is going to be required more. So I just wanted to contribute to that conversation.
Well, thank you so much, Gary, for your comments. And I want to also take a call from Sue, who's calling in from Guilford. Sue, you're on the line.
Yes, hi. Thank you for taking my call. Couple of things. I wanted to say that the $5 million that you reported as being added back to the Shoreline East is really not true. $30 million was removed by Ned Lamont, and to put back 5 of the 30 is not adding 30. It's restoring it. The Shoreline East is a vital piece of how traffic flows from New York City to Connecticut and from Connecticut to New York City. I live in Guilford, and to go to New York City now takes me 4 hours instead of under 3, pre-pandemic, of course. You've improved and restored trains from New Haven to Danbury, but not going east towards New London. So I don't know why that is. I think the ridership would come back if it didn't take so long. And also, the trains that you've restored are somewhat good, but you want to go to the theater. The last train out of the city, I think, is 6:31. I do it all the time, and it is really nearly impossible. So when I have to stay later than, 6 in the evening and want to get home at do something, I have to drive. It's ridiculous. I mean, I hear it from a lot of people. My last comment is you said something about the Amtrak. You'll see if the Amtrak can handle restoring some of the trains that go, east-west. They're complaining bitterly to us, the ridership, all the time. They're like, we have people suffering because they've lost their jobs. So 50% back from the pre-pandemic, that just doesn't cut it. So what are you planning to do? How are you going to help us?
Well, thank you so much, Sue, for your call and your comments, Commissioner. Want to take the funding question first, then we'll go into the rail line real quick.
Yeah, what I said is true. The budget restored $5 million on top of where we were operating today for funding for Shoreline East. So we're using that money in this budget that passed and was signed into law. It was an additional $5 million over what we have today as of what we had in May, and we'll use it to increase train service. And no one lost their jobs at Amtrak as a result. Amtrak has a national shortage of conductors and train engineers. So, yeah.
And any reactions more to what Sue's concern about increasing ridership and how difficult it is to use public transportation? Just a quick response there.
Yeah, it is east of New Haven, east of Branford, it's much less densely populated. Governor Lamont has talked quite a bit about we need to build more housing around the train stations that the state has invested in, significant tens of millions of dollars in each community to build new train stations. He'd like to see more density. We have a housing shortage. Let's see some housing get built there. We are restoring the service. We also have bus service in those communities, which can connect people to various other train stations. And don't forget, Amtrak also runs service through that corridor on their own trains. So there are opportunities to get around. It's not ideal, but it also costs a lot of money. And where we need to look at reallocating resources, if we have a shortage of funding, where can we reallocate those resources to where there is a growing ridership? And so that was, during the past few years, when we had limited funds available due to the state spending cap and other issues, we invested those funds where we have, a significant ridership base. But we're investing in Shoreline East with the $5 million. We're going to see what the ridership is after a year of that. And then we're going to give that report to the legislature and the governor. And it's really, we will provide whatever service we're given funding to provide. But it's ultimately a budget question statewide.
Well, thank you so much for that, Commissioner. You've been listening to Commissioner Garrett Ugolito. Thank you so much for being on the program with us and answering our questions.
Thank you.
Coming up, we hear from commuter advocate and author of the weekly opinion column, Talking Transportation. Let us know if you have more questions about transit. Give us a call, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. This morning, Connecticut Department of Transportation Commissioner Garrett Ugolito gave us an update on recovery efforts after last week's flooding here in Connecticut. And we also got into the latest on traffic, buses, bridges, roads, and all things transit. Now we're going to put some of that into context with the author of the weekly opinion column, Talking Transportation in Connecticut Mirror, and also a commuter advocate, Jim Cameron. Thank you so much for joining us on Where We Live today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
So you were listening to the conversation we were having with the commissioner earlier. Did you have anything jumped out to you immediately that you want to respond to?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, the commissioner and his staff, they've just done a tremendous job at trying to repair the damage from the flooding that occurred a week or 10 days ago. So kudos to them for that. That is a lot of work, and a lot of money has to be found to do those road repairs, and I hope the feds chime in with their fair share. I thought it was really interesting that much of the conversation was dealing with issues about people speeding on the highways and drunk driving, etc. And those aren't really DOT issues. Those are state police issues. And it's clear that the speeding is going unchallenged. The drunk drivers are not getting, pulled over. I hate to sound like a conservative reactionary, but we need more troopers to, disincentivize people from driving in these crazy ways. 216 traffic fatalities, pedestrians almost on a daily basis getting hit in smaller towns as well, too. DOT staff, people that are working to repair our roads. The commissioner mentioned that, a friend of his was one of those that was killed, a state trooper as well, too. There has been an experiment with speed cameras, automatic speed cameras. I think there should be more of those as well, too. Wrong way crashes on the Merritt Parkway. The DOT has been spending a lot of money putting up signs and warning signs, et cetera, et cetera. But here again, we don't have enough troopers that are patrolling those highways. So I don't want to blame Commissioner Ugolito, for whom I have a lot of respect, for problems that are really ones of traffic enforcement more than infrastructure building, et cetera.
Right, and that's certainly something that we have talked about both on the show and off, is regards to seeing the aggressive driving and speeding,
Yep.
and unfortunately with a limited time, we have so many more questions related to exactly what you're saying that we wanted to ask, but certainly we'll have to do another follow up conversation related to that. And but based on what you're saying too, do you think we're going to see a continuation of speed cameras? And do you know anything more about, because we got funding from the state legislature to put in red light cameras, but I think for most cities that has not been happening, or the movement has been very slow. Do you have any idea what's going on there, Jim?
Well, there seems to be a lot of negative reaction to, well, anything that inhibits me breaking the law, is the way I would put it. Red light cameras have some technological problems. People think that they're really just being used to raise money as opposed to enforce the traffic laws. I hope there are more red light cameras. It costs a lot to put a cop behind a wheel of a cruiser and patrol looking for people running red lights. And a red light camera can probably do it much more efficiently. So I think the commissioner really hit on something when he said this is a mental health issue, that people are being more aggressive because they're under a lot more stress. And, that's a hard issue for the state police or anyone else to have to address, let alone the DOT. One other thing that was interesting to me was you had a couple of callers from people who wanted to get more train service restored to Shoreline East.
Right.
And I think the callers were correct in that the huge budget cut that came from the Lamont administration was not even restored when $5 million was put in to add a couple more trains. And it was telling to me that Commissioner Eucalito hinted at what I think is the real issue. I think that the Shoreline East Territory, the southeast part of Connecticut, which I refer to as the forgotten corner, is being held hostage by the Lamont administration for transit-oriented development. They want to put a lot more development around the train stations. But the problem is, how do you get developers to invest money in housing and offices and
Right.
condos around train stations if there aren't any trains running? If you ran the trains first and proved that there was ridership and people that wanted to get out of their cars on 95 and take Shoreline East, then there would be a built-in demand for more TOD. So I think there's politics at play here more than anything else.
Well, and I think whenever we have conversations about public transit, really in any state, and being from California, not the best part, not the best state with public transportation, but it does exist in cities like LA itself. And the commissioner and I have had conversations on the show regarding to public transit, and people want to have that service, but if we don't have the service, obviously we can't use it. So you did touch on it a little bit with Shoreline East and with our callers. Can you also respond to sort of the current situation with reduced service on Metro North, and what else are you seeing in regards to rail service? Are you seeing, based on your reporting, any increase in ridership, or what are you hearing from people using the services?
Well, ridership on Metro North, the main part of Metro North from New Haven through Southwest Connecticut into New York City, has pretty much flatlined. I think it's about 73% of pre-COVID levels. And, I don't think that's necessarily changing because work from home has really become a way of life. Fridays, I look at the train stations where I live, and the parking lots are empty on Fridays. And although I was critical of the commissioner for doing this, I think he was probably right in reducing service on Fridays, trying to right-size the service to what the ridership was doing. However, I think the big problem and the biggest complaint I hear from riders on Metro North is the trains are too slow. They have been running slower for, is it 10 years now since the derailment in Bridgeport and Spoyton Dival? The Federal Railroad Administration came in and slowed down those trains. What used to be an hour-long commute is more like an hour 10. If you're coming from New Haven, they probably added 20, 30 minutes to your commute time on Metro North. So I hope that the DOT is working with Metro North to come up with some solutions, more zoned service. So you're not making every local stop all the way to Stamford and then Express. So if we made the train service faster, I think that would attract people out of their cars. I just don't understand watching people drive on I-95 at rush hour, bumper to bumper, and they can see the trains just off to their right-hand side or left-hand side. They're very close to I-95, and they're zooming along. They're doing 65, 70, 75 miles an hour, and these people are stuck in bumper-to-bumper traffic. I don't understand how people talk about stress. By the time you arrive at your office and you get out of your car and you go to your desk in the morning after enduring a half-hour crawl down I-95, I don't know how you can concentrate and be anything but stressed.
Right.
So I would just encourage people, try taking the train. Just do it once or twice and see if it isn't a little bit better than that mayhem.
Well, I think a lot of people could resonate with that stress. I think mine is I have a smaller car, and whenever I see a big truck or an SUV behind me that's tailgating, I'm like, you clearly can see above my car and see that I am also behind someone else, so I can't go any faster than you want, so I'm sorry. And you mentioned earlier, too, and we also had a lot of listeners who wanted to know more about needing more state troopers. They're seeing more state troopers on the road, needing more law enforcement, especially you mentioned earlier in terms of speeding and whatnots. But what are your thoughts on a need for increasing the Department of Transportation workforce? Because Commissioner Ugolito mentioned earlier, too, that they are having a hard time hiring enough engineers. So that also means they're not going to be able to work on projects that very much needs to have a move on. So what are your thoughts on that in particular?
Well, absolutely important issue, and I'm sorry he didn't address it more thoroughly given the time he had.
Sure.
There has been a shortage of engineers at DOT, which we knew was coming for like the past 5 or 10 years. A lot of senior people retired. They took the buyout. They took that golden parachute state employee pension. And it's been very challenging for the DOT to hire enough engineers, to have them in place to do the prep work that's going to be necessary to spend this spigot of money that's coming from the federal government. And if we want to get Connecticut's fair share of all this Build Back Better money from the Biden administration, we have to have plans in place. Now, the DOT is competing with the private sector. If I was a civil engineer and I was in school these days, looking for a future, it would be looking pretty bright. But I'm not sure I'd want to work for the DOT, especially when there are, consulting firms out there that are making $1 million per contract just to go in and take a look at an idea and come up with new solutions. So I know he's doing all he can. He's going out and doing a lot of outreach. They're talking to UConn to say, hey, can you get some more kids to take engineering courses? There are good jobs waiting to be taken in this DOT these days.
Well, thank you so much, Jim, for addressing that for us and being on the show today and helping us clear out some questions. You've been listening to Jim Cameron, who's a commuter advocate and author of the weekly opinion column, Talking Transportation at CT Mirror. Thank you so much, Jim, for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
I'm Catherine Shen. Today's show is produced by Tess Terrible and Chloe Wynn. Our technical producer is Dylan Reyes. Download Where We Live anytime on your favorite podcast app. Thank you so much for listening, and please drive safely.